I should have known that nothing about Dante Salvatore's world would ever be simple. Should have recognized that the moment a man shows up to a first date in a car, worth more than most people's houses, and wearing a watch that could fund a small country's economy, there are going to be complications that extend far beyond the usual relationship hurdles of meeting the parents or deciding whose apartment to spend the holidays at. But I was 28 years old, had spent the last 6 months falling hopelessly and recklessly in love with a man whose smile could make me forget my own name, and I was naive enough to believe that the most intimidating part of attending the Salvatore family's New Year's Eve celebration would be choosing the right dress and remembering which fork to use for which course, at what I assumed would be an absurdly formal dinner. I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror on the afternoon of December 31st, attempting to tame my dark curls into something that resembled elegance rather than chaos, when the full weight of what I was about to walk into finally settled over my shoulders like a heavy winter coat. Dante had been increasingly vague about what his family actually did for a living, always deflecting my questions with that devastating grin and a comment about import-export that I had been too infatuated to push back against, too caught up in the way he would show up at my art restoration studio with coffee and pastries, too distracted by how he would listen with genuine interest when I rambled about pigment analysis and the delicate process of bringing centuries-old paintings back to life. The dress I had chosen was a deep emerald silk that Dante had sent over 3 days earlier, with a note that simply read, "You'll outshine every star in the sky, amore mio." And I had spent an embarrassing amount of time pressing my face into the fabric and wondering what kind of man sends a woman a dress that probably cost more than her monthly rent, while also somehow knowing her exact size without ever having asked. My mother had called that morning, her voice tight with that particular tone she used whenever she was worried, but trying not to show it, asking me if I was absolutely certain about attending this party, about getting more deeply involved with that Salvatore boy, as she called him, and I had brushed off her concerns with the confident ignorance of someone who thought she understood the situation when she very clearly did not. The gift had been my mother's idea, actually, in one of those ironic twists of fate that makes you wonder if the universe has a cruel sense of humor, or if it's simply indifferent to the chaos it creates in people's lives. She had mentioned, almost offhandedly during our Christmas dinner, that I should bring something thoughtful for Dante's grandmother, that Italian families placed enormous importance on respect for elders, and that winning over the matriarch of the family would go a long way towards securing my place in Dante's life. I had rummaged through the boxes of my late grandmother's belongings that had been sitting in my closet for the better part of 3 years, items I had inherited when Nonna Lucia passed away, before I ever got the chance to know her, before I could ask her about her life, or understand the sadness that always seemed to linger in my mother's eyes whenever her name came up in conversation. The brooch had caught my attention immediately, nestled in a small velvet box that had been tucked beneath layers of yellowed photographs and handwritten letters in Italian that I had never bothered to translate. A stunning piece of vintage jewelry, featuring deep blue sapphires surrounded by delicate seed pearls, arranged in an intricate floral pattern that spoke of old-world craftsmanship, and the kind of artistry that you simply don't find in modern pieces. It was the sort of thing that an art restorer like myself could appreciate on multiple levels, the way the metalwork had been carefully constructed, the way each stone had been set with precision and care. And I had thought, in my spectacular blindness to what was coming, that it would be the perfect gift for a woman I had never met, but who had apparently raised the man I was falling in love with. Dante picked me up at 7 o'clock sharp, looking like he had stepped out of some impossibly glamorous film in a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than my car. His dark hair swept back in that effortlessly styled way that made my fingers itch to run through it. And when his eyes traveled over me in that slow, appreciative way that made my skin flush with heat, I felt a surge of confidence that I was going to survive this evening with my dignity intact. The drive to the Salvatore estate took us out of the city and into the countryside, where sprawling properties hidden behind tall iron gates and even taller hedges spoke of the kind of wealth that preferred to keep itself private, away from the prying eyes of people who might ask uncomfortable questions about where exactly all that money came from. "You look nervous, Tesoro," Dante said as we turned onto a long, tree-lined driveway that seemed to stretch on forever, his hand finding mine and giving it a gentle squeeze that was probably meant to be reassuring, but only served to remind me that I was about to walk into a world I didn't understand, surrounded by people who had known Dante his entire life and would be measuring me against some invisible standard I couldn't possibly hope to meet. "I'm not nervous," I lied, my fingers instinctively tightening around the small gift box in my lap, the weight of it suddenly feeling far heavier than it should have, as if the universe was trying to warn me about something I was too foolish to recognize. "I just want your family to like me, want your grandmother to approve of me, because I know how important she is to you." The estate, when it finally came into view, was not the ostentatious mansion I had half expected, but rather an elegant stone villa that looked like it had been transplanted directly from the Italian countryside, all warm, honey-colored stone and terracotta roof tiles, with manicured gardens that probably looked spectacular in spring and summer, but were currently dressed in their winter best of carefully pruned hedges and artfully placed lights that made the whole place glow like something out of a fairy tale. Cars lined the circular driveway, expensive vehicles that I couldn't even begin to name, and well-dressed people were making their way toward the entrance where I could hear the sophisticated murmur of conversation and the soft strains of live music drifting out into the cold December air. Dante kept his hand on the small of my back as we entered, a possessive but gentle touch that I had come to associate with his presence, and I was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of the interior, all marble floors and glittering chandeliers, oil paintings that my professional eye immediately recognized as genuine old masters rather than reproductions, and the kind of furniture that belonged in museums rather than private homes. Men in expensive suits stood in clusters, their conversations stopping mid-sentence as we passed, their eyes tracking our movement with an intensity that made me feel like I was being catalogued and assessed, while women dripping in jewelry that could have funded small nations watched with barely concealed curiosity, and what might have been either approval or disdain. I honestly couldn't tell which. "She's in the main salon," Dante murmured against my ear, his breath warm against my skin in a way that sent shivers down my spine, despite the heat of the crowded room. "Nonna likes to hold court on New Year's Eve, likes to receive guests and accept their well wishes for the coming year, so we'll go pay our respects first before I introduce you to the rest of the family." The main salon was a stunning room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gardens, currently filled with what must have been 100 people, all of them dressed in their finest, all of them seeming to know exactly where they belonged in this carefully orchestrated social hierarchy that I was only just beginning to understand existed. And there, seated in a high-backed chair that looked almost throne-like in its positioning and grandeur, was Nonna Catalina Salvatore, a tiny woman who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, but who commanded the room with the kind of presence that made everyone else seem diminished by comparison. Her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her black dress simple but clearly expensive, and her dark eyes sharp and assessing as they surveyed her kingdom with the authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she commanded. Dante led me through the crowd, which seemed to part automatically for him in a way that spoke volumes about his position in this family, and I clutched the gift box so tightly that I could feel the edges digging into my palm through the wrapping paper I had so carefully selected. When we finally stood before his grandmother, Dante bent to kiss both her cheeks with obvious affection, speaking to her in rapid Italian that I could only partially follow with my limited understanding of the language, and then he was pulling me forward, his hand still warm and steady on my back. "Nonna, this is Alessia Moretti," he said, switching to English for my benefit, his voice carrying a note of pride that made my heart flutter despite my nervousness. "The woman I've been telling you about, the art restorer who somehow puts up with my demanding schedule and terrible jokes." I extended my hand, was about to introduce myself properly, when those sharp, dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like she was reading every secret I had ever kept, every thought I had ever had, and I found myself fumbling for words like a nervous teenager rather than a professional woman who regularly dealt with demanding clients and high-pressure situations. "It's an honor to meet you, Signora Salvatore," I managed, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "Dante speaks of you with such love and respect, and I wanted to bring you something, a small token for the new year." I held out the box, watched as her elegant, age-spotted hands reached for it, noticed the way several people in our immediate vicinity had gone quiet, as if they too were curious about what this newcomer had brought for the family matriarch. The moment seemed to stretch on forever as she carefully unwrapped the paper with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested she was someone who never rushed, who took her time with everything because she had earned the right to do so. And when she finally opened the velvet box and saw the brooch nestled inside, I watched her face transform in a way that I would replay in my mind 1,000 times in the days and weeks to come. The color drained from her olive-toned skin so quickly that for a horrifying moment, I thought she might be having a heart attack, her hands beginning to tremble so violently that the box nearly slipped from her grasp, and the crystal champagne flute she had been holding in her other hand fell to the marble floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room like a gunshot. Her eyes, which had been sharp and assessing moments before, went wide with what I could only describe as terror mixed with recognition. And when she looked up at me, it was as if she was seeing a ghost, as if I had somehow reached across the boundary between the living and the dead and dragged something into this room that should have remained buried. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence that had fallen over the salon, every word carried with perfect clarity, and I felt Dante tense beside me, felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere as every person in that room turned to watch what was unfolding. "Where did you get Lucia's brooch?" My mouth went dry, my mind racing to understand what was happening, why this woman was looking at me like I had just confessed to murder, why the name she had just spoken, Lucia, was sending ice water through my veins. It was my grandmother's," I stammered, watching in growing horror as Nonna Catalina reached out with surprising speed and strength, her fingers wrapping around my wrist with a grip that was almost painful. "My grandmother, Lucia Romano, she passed away before I was born, and this was in her belongings. I thought it would be a nice gift. I didn't know." "Romano," she breathed, and the way she said that name, with such a complex mixture of recognition and pain, and something that might have been fear, made me realize that I had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple case of mistaken identity or coincidental jewelry. Lucia Romano, the girl who was never supposed to exist, and now here you stand, wearing her face, carrying her name. The room had gone so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me, and when I looked up at Dante, I saw confusion and concern warring on his face, saw that he was just as lost as I was about what was happening. Before I could ask what she meant, before I could try to understand why a brooch from my dead grandmother had caused such a violent reaction, I heard heavy footsteps approaching, and then a man's voice, deep and commanding and carrying the kind of authority that made people jump to attention, cut through the tension like a knife. "Mama, what's going on here?" Lorenzo Salvatore, Dante's father, a man I had only met once before at a brief and awkward lunch, pushed through the crowd with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question, and when his eyes landed on the brooch still clutched in his mother's shaking hands, I watched his expression shift from concern to something that looked suspiciously like panic. Where did that come from? But Nonna Catalina wasn't looking at her son, wasn't responding to his question, her eyes still fixed on my face with that same ghostly intensity, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger, carrying across the room with the kind of weight that comes from decades of command and respect. Get her out of here, Lorenzo. Get her away from this house before everything we've built comes crashing down, before the truth that we buried 50 years ago crawls out of its grave and destroys us all." Lorenzo moved with surprising speed for a man of his age and build, his hand closing around his mother's arm with firm but gentle insistence, already guiding her toward a side door while gesturing sharply to several men I hadn't noticed before. Men who were clearly security or staff or something more sinister, and I stood frozen in place, the gift box now lying discarded on the floor where Nonna Catalina had dropped it, the sapphire and pearl brooch glinting in the chandelier light like an accusation. Dante was speaking urgently to his father in Italian, his voice low and intense, but Lorenzo cut him off with a single sharp gesture, his eyes finding mine for just a moment. And what I saw there was not anger or confusion, but something far worse: calculation. The kind of cold assessment that suggested he was already 3 steps ahead, already planning how to contain whatever damage had just been done. The crowd began to murmur, the spell of silence breaking as people turned to their neighbors with excited whispers and speculative glances, and I realized with dawning horror that I had just become the center of attention at one of the most important social events of the Salvatore family's year, that I had somehow managed to unearth a secret that had been buried for half a century, and that the consequences of my innocent gift were only just beginning to unfold in ways I couldn't possibly predict or control. The drive back to my apartment was suffocatingly silent, with Dante's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. And every time I opened my mouth to ask him what had just happened, what his grandmother had meant by her cryptic words about girls who weren't supposed to exist, and truths buried for 50 years, he would shake his head in a way that made it clear he either didn't know or wasn't ready to talk about it, leaving me to sit in the passenger seat with my mind racing through possibilities that became increasingly unsettling the more I thought about them. He had walked me to my door with the kind of distracted courtesy that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely, had kissed my forehead in a gesture that felt more like goodbye than goodnight, and when I tried to pull him inside, tried to make him stay and talk through whatever storm we had just walked into, he had simply said, "I need to handle some family business, Tesoro. I'll call you tomorrow," before disappearing into the night like smoke, leaving me standing in my doorway with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. Tomorrow came and went without a phone call, without a text message, without any sign that Dante Salvatore remembered I existed. And by the second day of the new year, I had left him 6 voicemails and sent a dozen text messages that went unanswered, each one more desperate than the last, until I finally forced myself to stop, because I was beginning to sound unhinged even to my own ears. My mother called on the 3rd day, her voice carrying that same tight quality it had held before the party, and when I tried to explain what had happened, tried to tell her about Nonna Catalina's reaction to the brooch, and the strange things she had said about my grandmother, there was a long pause on the other end of the line that stretched on so long I thought we had been disconnected, until finally she said, "Alessia, I think you should leave this alone, should forget about the Salvatores and move on with your life," in a tone that suggested she knew far more than she was willing to share. But I couldn't leave it alone. Couldn't stop my mind from circling back to those moments in the salon when a simple piece of jewelry had caused a woman to look at me like I was a ghost. Couldn't shake the feeling that there was something fundamental about my own history that I didn't understand. Some missing piece of my family's story that everyone seemed desperate to keep hidden. I spent the next 2 days attempting to focus on work, trying to lose myself in the meticulous process of cleaning centuries of grime off a Renaissance painting that had been brought to the studio for restoration. But my hands kept shaking, and my mind kept wandering. And finally my boss, a kindly older woman named Margaret, who had mentored me since I graduated from art school, told me to take the rest of the week off, because I was clearly too distracted to be trusted with irreplaceable works of art. It was on the 5th day of the new year, with still no word from Dante and a growing obsession with understanding what had happened at that party. that I found myself standing in my mother's attic on a gray January afternoon, surrounded by decades of accumulated possessions and the musty smell of old memories that had been packed away and forgotten. My mother was at work, teaching her afternoon classes at the community college where she had spent the last 25 years in the English department, and I had used the spare key she kept hidden under the flower pot on her back porch, had climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, with a growing sense that I was about to cross some invisible line that, once crossed, would change everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. The boxes of my grandmother's belongings were exactly where I remembered them, stacked in the far corner beneath a small dormer window that let in just enough light to see by, and I began pulling them out one by one, opening them with increasingly frantic movements as I searched for something, anything, that might explain the connection between my grandmother Lucia Romano and the Salvatore family. Most of it was exactly what you would expect to find in the possessions of a woman who had died young. Clothing that had gone out of style decades ago. Books with Italian titles that I couldn't read. A few pieces of costume jewelry that held no particular significance. And I was beginning to think that I had made this trip for nothing when my hand hit something solid and unyielding beneath a layer of carefully folded linens at the bottom of the last box. The trunk was small, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, made of dark wood that had been carved with intricate patterns that suggested it was quite old, and it was secured with a heavy brass lock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, possibly decades, the kind of lock that suggested whatever was inside was meant to stay hidden. I sat back on my heels, staring at this object that I had never seen before despite having gone through these boxes when I first inherited them, and I realized with a start that someone had deliberately placed it at the very bottom, had buried it beneath layers of other items, as if they wanted to make sure it wouldn't be easily found, wouldn't be stumbled upon by accident by someone who might ask uncomfortable questions about its contents. The search for the key took another 20 minutes of increasingly desperate rummaging through drawers and boxes, until I finally found a small envelope taped to the underside of the trunk itself, which struck me as both incredibly obvious and brilliantly hidden, because who would think to look for a key in the very last place you would check, attached to the thing it was meant to open? My hands were shaking as I worked the old lock, as I heard the mechanism click open with a sound that seemed far too loud in the quiet attic, and when I finally lifted the lid, I found myself staring at a collection of items that made my breath catch in my throat, and my heart began to race with a mixture of excitement and growing dread. The photographs were on top, maybe 24 of them, and they showed a young woman who could have been my twin if not for the styling of her hair and the fashion of her clothes. A girl of maybe 18 or 19 with dark curls and eyes that sparkled with joy and mischief. And in every single one of them, she was with a man who made my stomach drop because I recognized him. Recognized the strong jawline and the way he held himself with casual confidence. Recognized him because I had seen his face in photographs at the Salvatore estate, in portraits that hung in the hallway, leading to the main salon. The young Vittorio Salvatore, Lorenzo's older brother, the uncle that Dante had mentioned once or twice in passing as having died tragically in some kind of business accident back in the 70s, was staring out at me from these photographs with his arm around my grandmother, with his hand holding hers, with his lips pressed against her temple in a gesture of such obvious intimacy and affection that there could be no mistaking the nature of their relationship. I picked up one photograph after another, my hands trembling so badly that I nearly dropped several of them, and I studied each image with the trained eye of someone who made their living analyzing visual details, noting the way they looked at each other with the kind of consuming intensity that spoke of deep love and possibly dangerous obsession, noting the way he touched her like she was something precious and fragile that might break if he wasn't careful, noting the locations in the backgrounds that suggested these had been taken in secret, in out-of-the-way places where they wouldn't be recognized or interrupted. It was the last photograph in the stack that made me stop breathing entirely, made my vision swim with unshed tears and confusion, and a growing anger that someone had kept this from me my entire life, because on the back of it, written in fading ink and handwriting that must have been my grandmother's, were the words, L and V, forever, no matter what they say. Summer 1973. Underneath the photographs were letters, dozens of them, written in Italian on thin paper that had yellowed with age, and though my Italian wasn't strong enough to translate them fully without help, I could pick out enough words to understand that they were love letters, passionate declarations of devotion and longing, promises of a future together that clearly had never come to pass. There were also newspaper clippings, carefully folded and preserved, with headlines that made my blood run cold. Tragedy strikes prominent families. Young heir killed in business deal gone wrong. Star-crossed lovers meet tragic end. And as I read through them with growing horror, I began to piece together a story that my mother had never told me, that no one had ever mentioned, about a forbidden romance between my grandmother Lucia Romano and Vittorio Salvatore, heirs to two rival families in New York's complex and dangerous social hierarchy. The articles were careful in their wording, using euphemisms and vague language that I recognized now as the kind of sanitized reporting that happened when powerful families wanted to control the narrative. But reading between the lines, it was clear that the Romanos and the Salvatores had been bitter enemies, had been engaged in some kind of territorial dispute or business rivalry that had made any kind of relationship between their families impossible, let alone a romantic one between their young heirs. Vittorio Salvatore had died in October of 1974, according to one article, killed in what was described as a business deal gone tragically wrong, but which sounded suspiciously like a hit when I read the sparse details. And just 3 weeks later, another article reported that Lucia Romano had died in childbirth, leaving behind a baby daughter who would be raised by relatives after both her parents were gone. I sat in the dusty attic with these revelations spreading out around me like the pieces of a puzzle I had never known existed, and I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of who I was and where I came from. Because if my grandmother had been involved with Vittorio Salvatore, and if she had died 3 weeks after he did while giving birth to my mother, then the mathematics of the situation suggested something that made my entire body go cold with realization. My mother had been born in November of 1974, which meant she had been conceived in early 1974, which meant that if Lucia and Vittorio had been together during that time, if their relationship had progressed to the point where love letters and secret photographs suggested it had, then there was a very real possibility that Vittorio Salvatore wasn't just my grandmother's lost love, but was actually my grandfather, which would make me not just some random art restorer who happened to be dating a Salvatore, but rather a member of the family by blood, a descendant of the very man whose death had supposedly ended this tragic love story. The sound of my phone ringing shattered the silence of the attic and made me jump so violently that I nearly knocked over the entire trunk. And when I looked at the screen and saw Dante's name finally appearing after 5 days of silence, I felt a surge of emotions so complex and contradictory that I couldn't begin to sort through them all. Relief that he had finally called, anger that he had made me wait so long, fear about what I had just discovered, and a desperate need to know if he had any idea about the connection between our families that went so much deeper than either of us had realized. I answered on the 4th ring, trying to keep my voice steady even though my entire body was shaking. And his first words were not an apology or an explanation, but rather a warning that made everything else I had been feeling crystallize into pure, ice-cold fear. Alessia, I need you to listen to me very carefully and not ask questions right now, he said, his voice tight with an urgency I had never heard before, and I could hear background noise that suggested he was in a car, maybe driving fast based on the way the engine sounds kept rising and falling. My father knows you've been digging into your grandmother's past, knows that you've been asking questions and looking into things that he thinks should stay buried, and he's not happy about it, which in my world means that you might be in danger whether you realize it or not. I opened my mouth to tell him that I hadn't been asking anyone questions, that I had simply been going through my own family's belongings in my mother's attic. But before I could get the words out, I heard a sound from downstairs that made every muscle in my body tense with animal alertness. The distinctive creak of the back door opening, the same door I had used to enter the house, the same door that should have been locked behind me. My mother wasn't supposed to be home for another 3 hours, wasn't supposed to finish her classes until late afternoon, and the footsteps I could now hear moving through the house below me were too heavy to be hers, too deliberate and measured to be someone who had simply stopped by for an innocent visit. "Dante," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself, as I frantically began gathering the photographs and letters and shoving them back into the trunk, my hands moving with desperate speed as I tried to hide the evidence of what I had discovered. "I think someone just broke into my mother's house. I think someone is coming up here right now, and I don't know what to do." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for maybe 2 seconds, but felt like an eternity. And when Dante spoke again, his voice had gone absolutely flat, in a way that scared me more than anything else that had happened over the past 5 days, a tone that suggested he had shifted into some other mode of being that I had never seen before, something cold and dangerous that reminded me of exactly whose family he belonged to and what that might mean. "Hide," he said simply, and I could hear him giving rapid-fire instructions to someone else in the car, could hear the engine sounds getting louder as he presumably sped up. "Hide right now, don't make a sound, and keep this line open so I can track your location, because I'm 20 minutes away and I swear to God, Alessia, if my father has sent someone to hurt you or intimidate you or do anything other than talk, there's going to be a reckoning in my family that's 50 years overdue." I scrambled behind a stack of old furniture as the footsteps reached the second floor and began moving toward the attic stairs. My heart pounding so hard, I was certain whoever was down there would be able to hear it, and I clutched my phone to my chest like it was a lifeline while trying to control my breathing and remain absolutely silent. The attic door opened with a long, slow creak that seemed designed to maximize terror, and as I peered through a gap in the furniture, I saw a figure silhouetted in the doorway, a man I didn't recognize but whose body language suggested he was very comfortable with violence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the distinctive accent of someone who had grown up in the old neighborhood, someone who had learned their trade in the streets before moving up to work for families like the Salvatores. "Miss Moretti, I know you're up here, and I know you've been going through things that don't belong to you," he said, conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather rather than whatever sinister purpose had brought him to my mother's house. And I watched in frozen horror as he began moving through the attic with methodical precision, checking behind boxes and furniture with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Mr. Salvatore sent me to deliver a message, to make it clear that some secrets are meant to stay buried, and that people who go digging in graves sometimes fall into them, if you understand my meaning. The way he said, "Mr. Salvatore," made it clear he wasn't talking about Dante, made it obvious that Lorenzo had sent this man to threaten me or worse, and I found myself wondering with distant, detached clarity whether I was about to die in my mother's attic surrounded by my grandmother's hidden past, whether this was how the story would end, with another tragedy to match the one from 50 years ago. But then I heard something that changed everything. Heard the sound of multiple cars pulling up outside the house with the kind of aggressive speed that suggested they weren't concerned about being subtle. Heard car doors slamming and voices shouting. And the man who had been stalking through the attic suddenly froze, his head snapping toward the window, as he apparently realized that whatever he had been sent to do was about to be interrupted by something he hadn't anticipated. "Step away from wherever you're hiding, Miss Moretti," he said, his tone shifting from conversational menace to something more urgent. "Because it seems your boyfriend has decided to make this a family matter, and when the young Salvatore shows up ready to go to war with his own father's men, things tend to get very complicated very quickly." The standoff in my mother's house lasted exactly 7 minutes, according to the timestamp on my phone. 7 minutes during which I remained frozen behind that stack of furniture, listening to male voices arguing in rapid Italian downstairs. 7 minutes during which I heard what sounded like furniture being moved and threats being exchanged, and the very real possibility that violence was about to erupt in the middle of my mother's carefully maintained living room, until finally Dante's voice cut through all the others, with an authority that suggested he had invoked some kind of family protocol or hierarchy that even his father's men couldn't ignore. And the intruder who had been searching the attic retreated down the stairs with a stream of what I assumed were Italian curses, based on the venom in his tone. When Dante finally appeared in the attic doorway, his expensive suit disheveled and his hair falling across his forehead in a way that would have been attractive under any other circumstances. The look on his face was something I had never seen before, a mixture of fury and fear, and something that might have been guilt. And when he saw me emerge from my hiding place, still clutching my phone and visibly shaking, he crossed the space between us in 3 long strides and pulled me against his chest with enough force to knock the air from my lungs. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over my arms and shoulders as if checking for injuries, his eyes scanning my face with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging every detail to make sure I was truly unharmed. And I found myself torn between wanting to collapse into his embrace and wanting to shove him away, because his family had just sent someone to threaten me in my own mother's house. "I'm fine. I'm not hurt. But Dante, what the hell is going on?" I managed to get out, my voice shaking with adrenaline and delayed shock and a growing anger that was beginning to override my fear now that the immediate danger seemed to have passed. "Why did your father send someone here? Why does he care what I'm looking into about my own grandmother? And why does everyone seem so desperate to keep me from learning about a relationship that ended 50 years ago when both people involved have been dead for decades?" He pulled back just enough to look at me, his dark eyes searching mine with an expression that suggested he was trying to decide how much to tell me, how many secrets he could reveal without crossing some invisible line of family loyalty. And I could see the war happening behind his eyes, could see him struggling between his feelings for me and whatever obligations he had to the Salvatore name. "Because they're not both dead," he said finally, the words coming out like they had been dragged from somewhere deep inside him, like he was betraying some fundamental trust by speaking them aloud. "Because my Uncle Vittorio is alive, has been alive this whole time, living in exile in Sicily while everyone in New York has believed for 50 years that he died in that business deal, and my father has apparently been keeping that secret, along with a lot of other things that I'm only just now beginning to understand." The world seemed to tilt sideways at that revelation, seemed to reshape itself around this new impossible reality, where the grandfather I had never known existed, where the man whose death had supposedly been the tragic end to a doomed love story had actually been living somewhere across the ocean for my entire life. And I felt my legs go weak enough that I had to sit down on one of the dusty trunks before I fell down. "He's alive," I repeated, the words feeling strange and unreal in my mouth. And I looked down at the photographs I had been clutching without realizing it, at the image of young Vittorio Salvatore with his arm around my grandmother, both of them smiling at the camera like they had the whole world ahead of them and nothing could touch them. If he's alive, then why has he been in hiding for 50 years? Why did everyone think he was dead? And what does any of this have to do with my grandmother dying 3 weeks after he supposedly did? Dante ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that I had come to recognize as his tell when he was stressed beyond his usual carefully controlled demeanor, and he began pacing the small attic space like a caged animal, his movements tight and controlled, but radiating an energy that suggested he was barely keeping himself together. "I don't know all of it yet. My father won't tell me everything, but from what I've been able to piece together from conversations I've overheard and things my grandmother has let slip over the years, the Romanos and the Salvatores were at war back then. Not just business rivals, but actual enemies who were fighting over territory and money and power in ways that people were dying over. When Vittorio and your grandmother fell in love, when they started seeing each other in secret despite both families forbidding any kind of contact, it created a situation that neither side could tolerate. Because if the heirs to both families united, it would have meant a complete restructuring of power dynamics that a lot of people had a vested interest in preventing. I thought about those newspaper clippings, about the carefully sanitized language that had described Vittorio's death and Lucia's death and the tragedy of star-crossed lovers. And I realized that what I had been reading was a cover story, a narrative that had been constructed to hide something much darker and more deliberate than simple misfortune or bad luck. "Your father had something to do with it, didn't he?" I asked, the pieces beginning to fall into place in my mind, even though I didn't want to believe what they were showing me. Didn't want to accept that the family I had been getting involved with had been responsible for whatever had happened to my grandmother. Lorenzo did something to keep them apart. Something that resulted in Vittorio having to fake his death and disappear. And something that resulted in my grandmother actually dying. And now he's panicking because I've stumbled onto the truth and he's afraid of what will happen if it comes out after all these years. I think so, yes, but I need to know more before I can be certain, Dante said. And the look he gave me was full of a pain that I understood on a fundamental level because he was realizing that his own father might be responsible for a murder that had happened before he was even born, that the family legacy he had been raised to honor and protect might be built on a foundation of violence and betrayal that he couldn't ignore or excuse. But right now, I need to get you somewhere safe. Need to make sure my father's men don't try anything else while I figure out what's really going on. And then I need to have a conversation with the one person who knows the entire truth about what happened 50 years ago. We left my mother's house with the trunk, and all its contents loaded into the back of Dante's car, with a promise from him that he would have someone come and repair the back door that his father's man had forced open. And as we drove through the darkening January afternoon, I called my mother and tried to explain in the vaguest possible terms that she needed to stay away from her house for a few days because there had been a break-in and the police were investigating. A lie that tasted bitter on my tongue, but which seemed safer than telling her the truth about what I had discovered and what it had set in motion. She sounded worried and confused and insisted that she was coming home immediately to check on things, and it took 15 minutes of increasingly desperate reassurances before she finally agreed to stay with her sister for a few days, before she accepted my promise that I would handle everything and that she didn't need to worry about anything other than keeping herself safe. Dante took me to a hotel, not one of the big corporate chains, but rather a small boutique place in a quiet neighborhood where he apparently knew the owner, and he got me a room on the top floor with instructions to the staff that I was not to be disturbed and that no one was to be given information about my presence there under any circumstances. "I'm going to see my grandmother tonight," he said as he stood in the doorway of my room, his hand lingering on the frame as if he was reluctant to leave me alone but knew he had to. "I'm going to make her tell me everything, make her explain what really happened and why she's kept these secrets for so long, and then I'm going to figure out what we do next, how we handle this without anyone else getting hurt." He left before I could argue with him, before I could insist that I should be there for this conversation, because it was my family too, my history that had been hidden from me, and I spent the next 3 hours pacing my hotel room and trying to make sense of everything that had happened, trying to reconcile the man I had fallen in love with over the past 6 months with the reality of what his family was capable of and what they had done to mine. When my phone finally rang at nearly 11 o'clock that night, I answered it before the first ring had finished, and Dante's voice on the other end was tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify, but which sounded like a mixture of anger and grief, and something that might have been fear. "She told me everything," he said without preamble, without asking if I was okay, or if I had eaten dinner, or any of the normal pleasantries that usually preceded our conversations. "My grandmother told me the whole story, and Alessia, it's so much worse than I thought, so much more complicated and tragic and fundamentally fucked up than I could have imagined. And now I understand why my father has been so desperate to keep this buried, why he sent someone to intimidate you. Because if this truth comes out, it doesn't just destroy him. It destroys the entire foundation of how our family has operated for the past 50 years. I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed, my hands gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles went white, and I made myself ask the question that I both desperately needed and desperately feared the answer to. What happened to my grandmother, Dante? How did she really die? And why has everyone been lying about it for my entire life? The silence on the other end of the line stretched out for so long that I thought the call had been disconnected. But then I heard him take a deep, shaky breath, heard him gathering himself to tell me something that was clearly causing him pain, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My father killed her. Had her killed. I don't know the exact mechanics of it, but the end result is the same. Lorenzo Salvatore murdered your grandmother because she refused to give up her relationship with Vittorio, refused to pretend the baby she was carrying wasn't his child, and he did it in a way that made it look like she died in childbirth so that no one would ask questions or investigate too closely. He gave Vittorio an ultimatum: disappear forever, fake your death and leave New York and never come back, and in exchange we'll let Lucia and the baby live. But Vittorio didn't know that Lorenzo was lying, didn't know that the moment he agreed to those terms and went into hiding, my father was already planning to eliminate the woman who could have united two families and ended the war that was making everyone rich. I felt something break inside me at those words, felt the carefully constructed understanding I had of my family history shatter into 1,000 pieces, because my grandmother hadn't died in some tragic twist of fate or medical complication, but had been murdered, had been killed deliberately and coldly by the father of the man I was in love with. And her death had been covered up so thoroughly that even her own daughter had grown up believing the lie. And the baby, my mother, how did she survive if Lorenzo was willing to kill Lucia? I asked, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears, as if I was listening to someone else ask the question. Your grandmother knew something was wrong, knew she was in danger, and she got a message to someone she trusted. Someone outside both families who could get the baby to safety, Dante explained. And I could hear him moving around, could hear the sound of a car door opening and closing as he apparently prepared to go somewhere. My grandmother helped her, actually, which is why she reacted the way she did when she saw you at the party. Why seeing that brooch and hearing the name Lucia Romano made her look like she had seen a ghost, because Nonna Catalina has been carrying the guilt of what her son did for 50 years, has been living with the knowledge that she helped save your mother, but couldn't save Lucia, couldn't stop Lorenzo from doing what he thought was necessary to protect the family's interests. The enormity of it all was too much to process, too much to hold in my mind all at once, and I found myself crying without really being aware that I had started. Found tears streaming down my face as I thought about my grandmother dying alone and afraid. Thought about my mother being smuggled to safety as an infant. Thought about Vittorio spending 50 years believing that both his wife and child were dead because he had trusted his brother to keep his word. Where are you going? I asked Dante, because I could hear the purposefulness in his voice, could tell that he was already moving toward whatever came next in this terrible story. I'm going back to the estate to get my grandmother, and then you and I are going to have a conversation with her, where she tells us everything, every detail of what happened and how it happened and why she's kept these secrets for so long, he said. And there was a determination in his voice that suggested he had made some kind of decision, had chosen some path forward that he wasn't going to be deterred from no matter what obstacles appeared. And then, Alessia, if you're willing, if you can stomach the idea of working with me despite what my family has done to yours, we're going to figure out how to make this right, how to give Vittorio the truth about what really happened, and reunite him with the daughter he never knew existed. The hotel phone rang, startling me so badly that I nearly dropped my cell phone, and when I answered it with a shaky, "Hello," expecting it to be the front desk calling about some mundane hotel matter, the voice on the other end made my blood run cold in a way that even the events of the past few hours hadn't quite managed. Miss Moretti, this is Lorenzo Salvatore, and I think it's time you and I had a conversation about your future, and whether you have one, because my son seems to have developed some very dangerous ideas about family loyalty and truth-telling that could have severe consequences for everyone involved, including you. I looked at my cell phone, saw that my call with Dante was still connected, saw that he could hear everything that was being said, and I made a decision in that moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable. A choice to stop running from this story and instead walk directly into its heart, no matter what that might cost me. Mr. Salvatore, I appreciate the call, but I'm not interested in having a private conversation with the man who murdered my grandmother, I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the fear that was making my heart race and my hands shake. If you want to threaten me or try to intimidate me into silence, you'll have to do it in front of your mother, because Dante and I are on our way to see her right now, and I have a feeling that Nonna Catalina is done keeping your secrets. I hung up both phones before he could respond, before I could lose my nerve or second-guess the confrontation I had just set in motion, and I grabbed my coat and bag and headed for the door, because whatever happened next, I was going to face it head-on, rather than hiding in a hotel room while other people decided my fate. When I reached the lobby, Dante was already there, having apparently broken every traffic law to get to me as quickly as possible, and standing beside him, looking smaller and more frail than she had at the New Year's Eve party, but with eyes that burned with a fierce determination that belied her age, was Nonna Catalina Salvatore, dressed in black like she was going to a funeral, and carrying herself with the bearing of someone who had finally decided that 50 years of silence was enough. "Get in the car, child," she said to me in accented English, her voice rough with emotion and age but still commanding enough that I found myself obeying without question. "It's time you learned the truth about what my son did to your family. Time you understood the price that was paid for the empire he built on your grandmother's grave. And time that someone finally had the courage to drag these secrets into the light where they belong, no matter what it costs us." We drove through the dark January night to the Salvatore estate, with a silence in the car that felt heavy and weighted with the enormity of what we were about to confront. And I sat in the back seat next to Nonna Catalina, while Dante drove with a controlled fury that manifested in the tension of his shoulders and the tight grip of his hands on the steering wheel, and the old woman beside me held my hand with surprising strength, her papery skin warm against mine in a gesture that felt like both apology and solidarity. When we arrived at the estate, every window was blazing with light despite the late hour, and Lorenzo's car was parked in the circular driveway like a challenge or a warning. And as we walked through the front door together, this unlikely trio united by secrets and blood and the need for truth, I could feel the weight of 50 years of lies pressing down on us like a physical force that made it hard to breathe. Lorenzo was waiting in the same salon where I had first met Nonna Catalina just days ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since that moment when a simple gift had unraveled the carefully constructed fiction that two families had maintained for half a century. And he stood by the fireplace with a glass of what I assumed was expensive scotch in his hand, looking every inch the powerful patriarch who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. His silver hair perfectly styled and his suit immaculate despite the hour. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew the foundation beneath him was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Mama, this is unnecessary and potentially very dangerous for everyone involved," he said, directing his words to his mother, but keeping his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made it clear he saw me as the real threat in this room, the outsider who had stumbled into family business that should have remained buried. "The girl doesn't need to know everything, doesn't need to understand decisions that were made before she was born, and dredging up the past serves no purpose except to cause pain and potentially destroy everything we've built." But Nonna Catalina moved past her son without acknowledging his words, settling herself into the same throne-like chair she had occupied at the party. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of authority that came from being the matriarch of this family, from having survived longer and seen more than anyone else in the room. And I understood in that moment that whatever power Lorenzo thought he held, it was nothing compared to the moral authority of a mother who had finally decided to hold her son accountable for his sins. "You murdered an innocent girl because you were afraid of peace," she said, and the starkness of those words, spoken without embellishment or euphemism, seemed to suck all the air out of the room and make time itself pause to witness this reckoning. "You gave your brother an ultimatum that you never intended to honor. You sent Vittorio away with promises that you would protect Lucia and their child, and then you had her killed 3 weeks later because you couldn't stomach the idea that the war with the Romanos might end. Couldn't accept that your path to power might be threatened by something as simple and profound as love between two young people who had the misfortune of being born into families that valued violence and territory over human life." I watched Lorenzo's face as his mother spoke, watched the carefully controlled mask slip just enough to reveal the calculation beneath it, the cold pragmatism that had allowed him to make that choice 50 years ago and live with it ever since. And when he finally responded, his voice was flat and devoid of any emotion that might have suggested remorse or regret. "It was necessary," he said simply, as if those 3 words could justify murder, as if the elimination of one pregnant girl was simply the cost of doing business in a world where weakness meant death and sentiment meant failure. The Romanos would never have accepted a true peace, would have used any alliance to position themselves to destroy us, and Vittorio was too naive and too blinded by his feelings to see that his precious Lucia was nothing but a liability, a weakness that could have been exploited to bring down everything our family had built over generations. Dante moved then, crossing the room to stand between his father and his grandmother in a physical manifestation of the choice he was making, the side he was taking in this family war that had been brewing beneath the surface for decades. And when he spoke, his voice was steady and clear and full of a quiet strength that made me fall in love with him all over again, despite everything, despite the horror of what his family had done to mine. "You're going to tell Alessia everything," he said to his father, and it wasn't a request but a command, spoken with the authority of someone who had finally stepped into his own power and wasn't going to back down no matter what threats or consequences were leveled against him. "You're going to explain exactly what you did to Lucia Romano, how you arranged her death, how you covered it up, and then you're going to give me the information I need to contact my uncle Vittorio in Sicily, because he deserves to know the truth about what happened to the woman he loved and the daughter he never knew existed. And if you refuse, I will walk away from this family and everything it represents, and I will make sure that every dirty secret, every buried body, every illegal deal comes to light in ways that will destroy everything you've spent your life building." The standoff between father and son lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. A silent battle of wills that would determine the future of the Salvatore family, and whether the crimes of the past would finally be brought into the light, or whether they would remain buried under layers of money and power and the kind of influence that could make inconvenient truths disappear. And I held my breath as I watched Lorenzo's face cycle through anger and calculation, and what might have been fear before finally settling on something that looked almost like resignation. What followed was a confession that was clinical in its detail and chilling in its lack of emotion, a recounting of how Lorenzo had arranged for one of the Romano family's own soldiers, a man who owed him a debt and who could be trusted to keep silent, to tamper with the medical care Lucia received during her delivery, how he had made sure that her death would look natural enough that no autopsy would be ordered, how he had personally overseen the removal of the infant and her delivery to a Romano cousin in another state who had been told only that the baby needed protection from family politics, and how he had spent the subsequent 50 years building his empire on the foundation of that calculated murder while his brother lived in exile, believing that both his wife and child were dead. By the time Lorenzo finished speaking, I was crying again. Silent tears streaming down my face as I thought about my grandmother's final hours, about her dying without the man she loved beside her, about her never knowing that the brother-in-law who had promised to protect her was the one who had ordered her death. And I felt Nonna Catalina's hand find mine again, her grip tight and trembling, as she too wept for the girl she had tried to save but couldn't, for the son she had raised who had become a monster, and for the 50 years of silence that had allowed this injustice to go unanswered. Dante sat beside me, his own face wet with tears that he made no effort to hide, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with grief and anger and a determination that suggested he had crossed some point of no return, and there would be no going back to who he had been before this night. "We're going to Sicily," he said, looking at me with eyes that held both pain and hope, both the weight of his family's crimes and the possibility of redemption. "You and me and Nonna, we're going to find Vittorio, and we're going to tell him the truth. We're going to reunite him with your mother, and then we're going to figure out how to make some kind of peace with a past that can never be changed, but can at least be acknowledged and honored." And so 3 weeks later, on a mild February morning in a small Sicilian village, where the Mediterranean stretched out blue and infinite beyond whitewashed houses and ancient olive groves, I stood with my mother, who had listened to the truth about her parentage with a stillness that spoke of deep shock, followed by a grief for a father she had never known, and watched as an elderly man, with silver hair and eyes that mirrored my own, walked toward us with halting steps, his face transformed by an emotion so raw and powerful that it was almost painful to witness. Vittorio Salvatore, who had lived for 50 years believing himself alone in the world, who had carried the weight of a love story cut short by what he thought was fate but was actually murder, who had spent half a century in exile mourning a wife and child, he thought were lost forever, reached out with shaking hands to touch my mother's face, to trace the features that must have reminded him of the girl he had loved and lost. And when he finally spoke, his voice breaking on every word, he said only, "Lucia's daughter, my daughter. You're alive and you're here, and I thought I would die without ever knowing." The reunion that followed was chaotic and emotional and beautiful in ways that made my heart ache with both joy and sorrow. And as I watched my mother embrace the father she had never known, while Nonna Catalina stood nearby weeping with what looked like both happiness and the release of 50 years of guilt, I felt Dante's hand slip into mine, felt him anchor me to the present moment, even as we all struggled to reconcile the past with this unexpected future we had created by refusing to let the truth stay buried. We stayed in Sicily for 2 months, learning Vittorio's story and sharing ours, building relationships that had been stolen from us by violence and lies, and the kind of pride that valued power over human connection. And when we finally returned to New York, it was with a new understanding of who we were and where we came from, and what we owed to the people whose love had been destroyed, but whose legacy we carried forward in our very existence. Lorenzo never apologized, never showed remorse, but his power within the family began to crumble as the truth of what he had done spread through the networks of loyalty and obligation that held their world together. And within a year, he had been quietly removed from his position of authority, replaced by Dante, who began the long and difficult work of transforming the family business into something that didn't require blood and violence to sustain itself. I married Dante on a warm June day in that same Sicilian village where we had found Vittorio, and my mother walked me down the aisle with her father beside her, both of them wearing expressions of joy, mixed with the bittersweet knowledge that Lucia should have been there too, that she should have lived to see her daughter grow up and her granddaughter find love, that she should have had the 50 years with Vittorio that were stolen from them both by a man who valued power over everything else. The brooch, the sapphire and pearl piece that had started this entire journey, sits in a frame on my mantel now, a reminder of how a simple gift can unravel decades of carefully constructed lies, how love can survive even when the lovers don't, how truth has a way of emerging no matter how deeply it's buried. And as I look at it on this quiet evening with Dante reading beside me and my hand resting on my pregnant belly where our daughter grows, I think about the cycles of history and violence and love that connect us all across generations. And I make a silent promise to the grandmother I never knew that her great-granddaughter will grow up knowing the truth about where she came from, about the price that was paid for her existence, and about the enduring power of a love that even death and 50 years of separation couldn't fully destroy.